welcome back. Now, I'm going to say this again, just to put it out there. What I am about to express in this video is my own interpretation of history. It's not written in stone by any means. If somebody comes up and shows me something which I've misunderstood or mistaken, and you can convince me otherwise, I will change my mind. I do not have any problem with that. Other people will interpret history entirely differently to what I do. That's good as well. But I will say, you will have to go something to convince me otherwise. Now we're looking at the origins, history and the ubiquity of the thumb release. And in this video we're going to cover why and how it becomes the ubiquitous technique within its realm of influence. Now, in the last video we left the Assyrian Empire transitioning from chariot warfare to horseback based warfare, using thumb release and creating horseback archers. Now that technique spreads, and it spreads eastwards into Persia, where we see the Persian Empire, and there are other relief carvings from this culture showing thumb release being used. But not just as horse archers, there are depictions of mounted and foot archers using thumb release. It's a little bit different to the Assyrian, as in the Assyrians I think are shooting above the arrow, like gripping above the arrow. The Persians are gripping below the arrow in what has become the standard sort of thumb release, which is more akin to the Chinese thumb release. So we're going from, we've got it in Asia Minor, in the two main cultures of the region. If we go up into the Indus Valley, we see it there as well with the Medes and the Median culture. Into India, the Indian subcontinent, we see it there as well, and it's actually depicted and described quite clearly within one of the Indian epics. There's two epics, there's the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Ramayana mainly covers society and things like that. The Mahabharata covers a lot of military stuff, and it's the story of a civil war between two households. And archery is described in there as being used by 7 of the main heroes of the story. And thumb release is quite distinctly and deliberately described as a technique used. Now the Mahabharata dates from around about the 3rd century BCE. So we're looking at about the same time as the Chinese, if we pop back up into China, as the Chinese are instigating horse archery. Now we know that they've already had the thumb release for 1500, 2000 years by now. But when we get to 307, there is and it's documented as well, documented evidence that they are instigating horse archery. You know, why are they doing it at this point? Because they continue to use chariots, but things have changed a little bit. They have created the Silk Road. And by the time we get to about 250, 260 BCE, the Silk Road is thriving. There's 3 routes. There's the northern route, which travels along the, we'll call it the Mongolian steppe for now, to the Black Sea and into northern Europe. There's a central route which goes through the Himalayas, through the Hindu Kush, into the Asia Minor, and to the coast of the Mediterranean. And then there's the southern route, which goes down into Indochina and into Asia proper, into the Indian subcontinent. Now all of these routes have to be protected, so the Chinese are instigating military horse archers. Now the other thing that's going on as well is we see what is essentially the first ever example of international trade cooperation, because all the countries along the various Silk Road trade routes agree to provide protection and security for the caravans, the trade caravans travelling along the Silk Road. But we also see, we've got to go back a little bit, the Shanghai coalition. Now they come from northern China, and in about 500 BCE they are invited to leave China. So they migrate into what is now Mongolia, the Mongolian steppe. And there are 9 tribes. So they enter Mongolia. At the time when they start to migrate, they are nomadic, but they're not pastoral horse peoples. However, over the next 200 years, they evolve into and become assimilated with the pastoral horse cultures which are already on the steppe, are already in Mongolia. And they blend with them and intermarry, and the 9 tribes assimilate other tribes and become nascent Mongolians. But they're still at war with China, so they are constantly raiding into China and raiding the trade routes, and generally making a pest of themselves. So we have this, and this carries on over the next couple of 100 years. Now the ubiquitous horse archer using the thumb release is put in place in various cultures, various parts of the trade routes, to chase off the marauding 9 tribes. At the same time, we actually see a mass migration of peoples, of tribal peoples, coming out of Asia and Asia Minor, coming out of Scandinavia, and they're all coming into areas where they can take advantage of the increased trade. So over the next 300 or 400 years, we see people such as the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Huns, the Magyars, the Bulgars, the Avars, the Alans, the Aryans, all of these different tribes of nomadic, semi-nomadic peoples moving into areas and settling. And a lot of them settle in the Carpathian mountain range, or bordering the Carpathian Mountains in central eastern Europe. Particularly the Huns, they settle in the Carpathian Basin, and then by around about 300 AD, they have actually created Hungary. So this is what's happening. It's all quite busy. There's lots going on. Now the horse cultures, we'll go back to why with the horse culture they adopted the thumb release. Now the type of archery they've been doing requires a short bow. Well, it doesn't require a short bow. They are making short composite bows because they have a limited amount of material from which to make their bows. And they make them in a particular way because of the lack of materials. So they don't bend over their whole length, such as a recurve bow or a deflex bow or a longbow does. For instance, an English longbow, apart from the very stiff central handle section, which is usually about 6 to 8 inches, they bend over their entire length. Nubian deflexed longbows bend over their entire length. Egyptian composite antelope recurves and palmwood longbows bend over their entire length. Traditional horse bows don't, because they have to be made to bend in certain places because of the lack of material. And the thumb release just happens to fit ideally, well not ideally, happens to fit in with that system. And because of the exposure to the Shanghai, who have always used the thumb release, it becomes de rigueur within the pastoral horse communities, within Eastern Europe, within the steppe, within Mongolia. It becomes ubiquitous. It becomes the technique. Everybody uses it, whether on foot or on horseback. So there we've arrived at a point in which the thumb release is ubiquitous. It's not just used with horse archery. It is the technique used for thumb release in all archery throughout its sphere of influence. The steppe, Mongolia, east of the Carpathians, the Asian, the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Plateau, the Indus Valley, India itself, Indochina, China, the northern set. It's ubiquitous. It's really the main technique used. So we've arrived at a situation where it's ubiquitous. Now we've got to consider why it's ubiquitous now, or why it's becoming more and more popular today. Why it's becoming, it is the fastest growing form of archery really, is the thumb shooter. But why? Well, if we go back to the 1980s, the 1990s, in the archery clubs, and I can only speak for the UK, for England, nobody had ever even seen a horsebow. The first or even heard about them being used within archery clubs. They just weren't a thing. The first time I ever saw a horsebow was, I think it was like 2004, 2005, and it was a friend of mine from my archery club who went on holiday to Turkey, and he brought back a horsebow purely as a tourist piece. But when he tried to shoot it, it worked. He didn't realise that it was a proper bow. He thought it was just a tourist piece, like those silly hats you get from Spain, and the donkeys people bring back, or used to bring back from Spain, and the models of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He thought it was just a tourist thing, but it wasn't. It was a real thing. Now since then, I've noticed that the thumb release style of archery is becoming more and more popular. For instance, like I said, in 2002, or 2003, 2004, there was no horse archery within England, really. Now, 2022, even in my club of about 250 members, there's about 50 who regularly shoot thumb release. It's taken over from the traditional longbow shooting. For instance, when I first joined the club, there was 200 modern shooters and about 10 longbow shooters, and that was it. And I think it was 3 or 4 compound shooters. Now, out of about 250 members, there's at least 50 who regularly shoot thumb release, and there's still only about 10 who regularly shoot longbow. So thumb release has overtaken the traditional English longbow in terms of popularity. Maybe because it's easier to shoot, maybe because it produces a faster bow, I don't know, but it's taking over. And I think part of that is social media, and film, TV and literature. There are films coming out of China which, for a long time, people didn't notice the archery. It was just archery. But people are re-watching films like Hidden Tiger, Crouching Dragon, or Hidden Dragon, Crouching Tiger, things like that. People are re-watching those epics. The Great Wall, they're re-watching things like that. Modern TV series which are coming out of China, history-based TV series. Now, to the Chinese, when they are depicting archery, they just do it with the thumb release. That's all they really know. But Europeans, Westerners, are starting to notice it. They're watching these programs and taking note of the archery. Especially people who've got an interest in archery anyway. We also have a situation where traditional archery traditions within Europe are changing. For instance, Hungary recently made it a law that in order to call a bow Hungarian within the EU, it has to be made in Hungary. You can sell bows outside the EU and call them Hungarian style or whatever, but within the EU it's a protected characteristic. And in order for it to be called Hungarian, it must be made in Hungary. So that's the sort of level that archery, traditional archery and historic archery, is reaching within the popular culture as it stands today. So we have, and this is all to do with the media. For instance, TV series, which I think was on Amazon or Netflix, like Marco Polo, depicting Marco Polo's adventures along the Silk Road into China, his encounters with Alexa, stop. That's Alexa telling me I've been waffling for 15 minutes. So he covered Marco Polo's adventures and his encounters with the various peoples. So it's becoming part of modern day culture, the media-based culture, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because it is exposing more people to history. For instance, when I was a kid, the only people who watched history documentaries were people like myself who were interested in history. Most of my friends didn't bother watching documentaries about history. They were only interested in their favourite TV shows, the comedy shows. Their parents watched the soap operas, and then sport. Everything else was sport. Whereas me and my mother and I actually enjoyed watching history. So I grew up in a household that enjoyed history. But most people didn't, until we get into the social media, mass media days, with the advent of the internet and things like that. So now we have the TV showing these cultures, these archery traditions. People are watching these because it's an exciting drama to watch. But as a result, they're becoming interested in the history side of it. And because history is so accessible now through things like YouTube and the internet, and even to a certain extent Wikipedia, people are exploring as a result. So it's becoming more and more popular, which I think explains the explosion in the popularity of thumb release. Not horse archery, although horse archery is more popular, but it's the thumb release techniques with the Mongol style bows. Another thing which has caused the explosion is the ethos and the mythology around the Mongols. Now people think it's ancient history. It's not. Most people don't realise that the Mongol Empire was only brought to an end in the 15th century, the 1500s. Sorry, not the 15th century, the 1500s, with failed incursions into the Indian subcontinent. They only came to become a military dominant empire, the Golden Horde, when all the 9 tribes of the Shanghai were brought together into one under the rule of Kublai Khan in 1206. That's when he amalgamated all those tribes. He brought all the steppe people, all the horse tribes together under one banner of the Mongols in Mongolia. And it's at that point that they become the military entity that we all find so fascinating. But it's only 700-800 years old, so it's relatively modern history, but it's stuck in the mind as being something esoteric and fascinating and intriguing, and that has fed into the whole popular culture that we see today. Anyway, I've waffled on enough. Keep an eye for my next video. It might be a bit controversial. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we will talk again soon. Cheers, guys.